welcome to my channel, a place where every mystery hides a story, and every story hides a truth. In the midst of forgotten streets, footsteps echo through the silence, and the faint glow of a lamp guards secrets that refuse to die. Every clue matters. A torn letter, a fading footprint, even the sound of a clock ticking in the dark. Here, doubt becomes a puzzle, and puzzles lead us to the heart of the unknown. So prepare your mind, watch closely, and listen carefully, because the shadows are speaking, and the truth is waiting to be found. This is where every case begins. Welcome to my channel. Asterisk.
Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime in a Damp Morning in Late October. As a pale drizzle streaked the windows of our Baker Street lodgings, I found Sherlock Holmes seated cross-legged upon the floor, surrounded by sheaves of musical notation. The fireplace had long since gone cold, but Holmes paid it no heed, absorbed as he was in a silent examination of the tattered pages before him. A single sheet, worn and slightly crumpled, lay carefully flattened beneath a magnifying lens, its treble clefs and eighth notes interrupted by faint, irregular splotches. Salt, he murmured without looking up. I had just returned from a brief stroll to fetch the morning paper, and I blinked at him, unsure whether he was addressing me or merely continuing a private dialogue with his own thoughts. "I beg your pardon, Holmes." He tapped the page twice with a long, slender finger. "Crystal-in residue salt. Not sea salt, either. Table salt, judging by the crystalline structure. How on earth do you—" But he waved my question aside with a flourish and stood in a single graceful motion. "Watson, how do you suppose a man is found drowned in an opera house?" I stared at him blankly. "Drowned." He strode to the fireplace, deposited the page into a small envelope, and tucked it into the pocket of his dressing gown. "Drowned," he repeated, "in a locked room beneath the orchestra pit at the Royal Lyric Theatre, with no water source and no sign of forced entry. My word, it appears." "My dear fellow," he said, already reaching for his coat. "That we are required." Before I could reply, the door burst open, and in swept a tall, angular figure in the unmistakable uniform of Inspector Lestrade. His cap was soaked, his face flushed with urgency, and his boots left dark prints across the rug. "I thought I might find you already dressed," he snapped. "It's one for the books, Holmes. Composer found dead. Drowned, they say. In the orchestra cellar. No water, no forced entry. No explanation." Holmes smirked. "You see, Watson, Scotland Yard is in agreement." Lestrade scowled. "It's madness down there. Half the performers say it's a curse. One of the tenors fainted. I've never seen such a mob of hysterical sopranos in my life. And the deceased, name of Roderick Dunbridge, music director, wrote the finale for the Sirens, promised the big operatic debut tonight. He was supposed to be conducting rehearsals this morning, and you say he was drowned?" Holmes asked, eyes narrowing. "Drowned, yes. Face pale as death. Water in the lungs. But not a drop of it to be found in the room. Door locked from the inside, and no one saw anything." Holmes turned to me. "You see, Watson, a composer silenced not by critics, but by drowning in a room that defies such means." I set aside my hat and reached for my coat. "I take it we are to the theater, then." "To the Royal Lyric," Holmes said, "to examine how a man can drown where there is no water, and how music, it seems, may hold its breath long enough to conceal a murder." The theater loomed in faded majesty above the fog-wrapped streets of Covent Garden. Red velvet curtains framed the grand facade, but the morning gloom robbed it of any glamour. As we entered through the stage door, escorted by a fretful assistant stage manager, we descended a narrow staircase lit by gas sconces and the hushed panic of whispering stagehands. The scene of the crime lay beyond a narrow corridor beneath the stage and acoustic storage room. Stone-walled and silent, 2 constables stood guard outside the door. Lestrade unlocked it with a brass key. Still just as we found it. Inside, the room was small, windowless, and bare but for a wooden chair, a sheet music stand, and a carpet that had clearly once been vibrant, but now lay faded and damp, and there lay the body. Roderick Dunbridge was sprawled on his back, eyes wide, his mouth slightly ajar. His clothes were soaked through, yet the room was perfectly dry. There were no puddles, no dripping pipes, and no means by which any significant amount of water could have entered. The very air felt parched. Holmes circled the body in silence, then knelt beside it. He touched the man's jacket, then drew a gloved finger along the lapel and brought it to his nose. "Salt," he whispered again. Lestrade looked baffled. "Salt? You mean sea salt?" "Not sea salt," Holmes replied. "That would suggest drowning in seawater. This is refined, processed, perhaps even treated." He then turned to the chair and bent low to inspect it. From beneath the seat, he drew a scrap of parchment, brittle and yellowed. "Sheet music," he noted, unfolding it. "The final movement of the Siren's Promise. It ends here, see. A solo violin note, held for 6 bars. Very unusual." He sniffed the page and held it towards me. I caught it at once, a faint, acrid tang. "Brine," I offered. Holmes smiled faintly. "Or tears." He rose and faced Lestrade. "You say the door was locked from the inside?" "Dead bolted. And the only key was found in his coat pocket, and there are no other entrances." Lestrade gestured to the walls. "Solid stone." Holmes turned slowly, surveying the ceiling. Then his eyes lit with sudden interest. He pointed to a tiny, narrow slat of ventilation grill, no more than 6 inches wide, high up in the wall above the door. "I'll need a ladder," he said simply. "But no man could fit through there." Lestrade objected. "Indeed," Holmes said. "Which is why it must be examined at once." He turned to me. "Watson, I should like you to accompany me to the orchestra loft. There is something quite wrong with the acoustics of this theater." I blinked. "The acoustics?" "Yes, I believe this murder was not merely seen or heard, but composed." And with that, he strode from the room, leaving the corpse, the salt-stained page, and a gathering storm of confusion in his wake. Chapter 2. Holmes and the violinist's postulator that afternoon. The gaslights in our Baker Street sitting room burned with a steadier glow than the fog-dulled sun outside. I sat by the fire, scribbling notes in my journal while Holmes paced the room with restless energy. His fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his eyes half-lidded, as though peering into some unseen ledger of truth only he could read. On the low table beside him lay the sheet music once found beneath the chair at the theater. Holmes had pinned it flat beneath to crystal paperweights. Its edges were frayed, and the salt stains had dried into faint white ghosts, forming uneven tracks across the staves. "Tell me, Watson," he said abruptly, "what do you know of the Siren's Promise?" I glanced up. "Only that it's a modern opera. Dunbridge's most ambitious work, they say." The papers hailed it as an eerie triumph. Some whispered that he composed it during a bout of hallucinations brought on by insomnia. Others hinted that he'd gone quite mad. Holmes nodded. "Indeed, and it was to premiere this very evening, was it not?" "At 7:30, I replied. "I passed the posters on our way in." He turned to the fire and stirred the coals with the toe of his slipper. "Consider the symbolism, Watson. The victim, a composer, was found dead in silence, in the very room where his music should have been echoing into life, yet drowned," I said. "In a room without water." "Precisely." A short knock interrupted our conversation. Mrs. Hudson entered with a modest tray of tea and a folded note atop the porcelain lid of the teapot. "This arrived just now, Mr. Holmes," she said, "from the Royal Lyric." Holmes took the note, nodded his thanks, and read quickly. His brows lifted ever so slightly. "Ah, Miss Vera Ormond wishes to speak with us. Soprano, lead role in tonight's performance. Do you suspect her?" I asked, taking the cup she offered. He smiled faintly. "Not yet. But she was the last person to see Dunbridge alive. We met Miss Ormond at the theater's rehearsal hall, where she was wrapped in a cloak of lavender wool, seated near the piano. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water, and she stood the moment we entered, her dark eyes wide with a mix of fear and eagerness. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "you must forgive me. I didn't know whom else to speak with." "Inspector Lestrade." He dismissed me. Holmes gave her a gracious nod. "You were close to Mr. Dunbridge." "I was his muse," she said, with a sadness that carried no vanity. "He wrote the Siren's Promise for me. It was to be his masterpiece and mine." Watson and I took our seats. Holmes, as always, remained standing, examining her as he might a museum piece, gently, but with immense scrutiny. "Tell me, Miss Ormond," he began, "when did you last see Mr. Dunbridge?" "Last night, just after the final rehearsal. He asked me to stay behind while the others left. Said he wished to discuss the final note, the final note." She nodded. "Yes, the opera ends not with a flourish, but with a single held violin note. He called it the suspended truth. said it was meant to echo like the final breath of the drowned. The drowned. I echoed. Miss Ormond looked down at her gloved hands. He believed the siren of the opera my character had not sung a song, but cast a spell. That her voice was not a melody, but a death sentence, a dramatic conceit. Holmes murmured. No, she said, lifting her gaze. He believed it. There was a silence then, broken only by the creak of the piano stool as she shifted slightly. I heard him whisper it once, she continued. He said, music is not art, Vera. It is control. Holmes turned toward the window, watching the soot gray light filter through the panes. Did he mention feeling threatened? Only in the way artists do. He said people misunderstood his work, called it too bleak, too unnatural. But they feared him more than they scorned him, feared him. She hesitated. The cellist Mr. James Harker. He loathed Dunbridge. Said he was rewriting death with that opera. Watson leaned forward. Do you know what that meant? She gave a faint shake of her head. I asked once. Harker only laughed and said, when you stare into that last chord, you'll understand. Holmes tilted his head. And where might we find Mr. Harker now? He refused to perform after Dunbridge died. He stormed out. Said he'd not be a part of any cursed finale. Holmes made a soft noise of interest. Do you know if Dunbridge kept copies of the score? Miss Ormond paused. Only one copy existed, I believe. The one he carried always. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the salt-stained sheet. Then what, Miss Ormond, do you make of this? She peered at the page, her eyes widening. That's the final movement. But it's altered. That isn't how it ended. The real version there was no rest at bar 34. The violinist was meant to carry through. You're sure? Quite. Holmes carefully folded the page and returned it to his pocket. Then it seems, he said, we are dealing with more than one composer. We returned to Baker Street in pensive silence. Holmes immediately went to his desk and removed a small stack of concert programs and performance pamphlets from a drawer. He laid them side by side. Look here, Watson. Notice anything peculiar? Each program bore the same opera title, The Siren's Promise. But the listed durations of the final act varied from 15 minutes to 17. Then back to 16 and a half, timing inconsistency. I guessed, indeed, suggesting that the ending was in flux, being changed. Holmes drummed his fingers on the table. A man rewrites death through music. He is found drowned. The sheet music is tampered with. The final note stained with salt. What are we to make of it, Watson? I opened my mouth, but he stopped me with a glance. No, he said. Don't answer. We haven't enough yet. Not until we speak with the cellist who feared a finale more than the death of its author. He turned to the window again, watching the evening shadows spread like ink over the city. And mark my words, Watson, somewhere in this opera, someone has played a note that should never have been written. Chapter 3. A scene of deception found James Harker at a dimly lit tavern just south of the Strand. A cramped, smoky place that stank of ale and defeat. He was hunched alone in the corner, his coat collar turned up, and a half-drained glass of gin on the table before him. His cello case leaned beside him like a sentinel, battered and travel-worn, the edges reinforced with brass corners dulled by time and hard-used. Holmes approached without ceremony. Mr. Harker, I presume. The cellist looked up slowly. His eyes were rimmed with red, his fingers stained with rosin and trembling slightly. If it's the press, he said gruffly, you'll get nothing from me. It is not the press, Holmes said coolly. It is Sherlock Holmes. And you are sitting on a lie. Harker's hand froze mid-reach for his drink. What lie? Holmes seated himself across from him. I joined at his side, noting the deep lines etched into the man's face lines, not solely from age, but stress, regret, and sleeplessness. The lie, Holmes said, that Dunbridge died alone. That you left without confrontation. That you feared a myth rather than a man. Harker swallowed. What do you want? The truth, Holmes replied, folding his hands. For a long moment, the only sound between us was the clink of glass and the distant murmur of the city beyond. Then Harker sighed. I stayed after the final rehearsal, he muttered. Went back down after everyone left. I was furious, because of the ending. Yes, he snapped. He changed it, again. The held note, he called it 6 bars of silence riding a single dying breath. No rhythm, no structure. Madness. Music should move, not linger like a ghost in the rafters. Holmes tilted his head. And you told him this? I did. Loudly. Did it become physical? No. Harker said, eyes narrowing. But I said I'd not perform it. I told him his music was killing something sacred. Holmes gave a tight nod. And then he laughed, said it was already done, that the music no longer needed a performer. Watson shifted uneasily. What did he mean by that? Harker stared into his glass. I don't know. But when I left him, he was humming the tune from the Siren's final aria, just ... Humming into the dark. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, did Dunbridge have enemies? The cellist snorted. Everyone at the theater admired his brilliance, but no one liked him. And why was that? Harker's voice lowered. Because he listened to no one. He changed tempos during performances. He reworked scores minutes before curtain. He thought the music belonged only to him, once even said, "A singer is but a breath moving through my mind." He paused. And there was something else. He kept that ending secret until 2 days ago. Swore us to silence. Made us sign sealed agreements. Holmes' eye sharpened. Agreements. Yes, contracts. He said the ending was the opera's soul, and no one was to leak it before the premiere. Were the contracts in writing? Of course, Holmes stood. And who else signed them? All principal performers, Harker said, counting off on his fingers. Vera Ormond, Basil Linley, the tenor, the conductor, Everett Shaw, and Mr. Sutton, the theater's managing director. Holmes gave a faint smile. Then the score was more than a composition, it was a secret. That evening, back in our lodgings, Holmes examined the salt-stained score once more under lamplight. He pointed at bar 30 for the abrupt silence Miss Ormond had noted. Notice, Watson, he said, how the score transitions here. A sustained note without crescendo. No resolution. No direction. It ends in limbo, I observed. Exactly. And that, he said, is not Dunbridge's style. He moved to his desk, removing a small velvet case from a drawer. Within lay an assortment of glass slides, lenses, and a brass loop. Carefully, he clipped the salt-stained sheet onto a board and adjusted the lens until it magnified the musical notation. What do you see? I asked. A forgery, he replied. My heart quickened. You're certain? Without doubt. Observe the ink. He shifted the light. Different density. The final 2 measures have been overwritten, faint pencil impressions beneath. The real ending lies beneath the false one. I leaned in. There it was, a ghostly trace, as if the page itself remembered the truth. Holmes straightened. Someone tampered with this score after Dunbridge died, or perhaps even before. And they had a reason to do so. I stared. But who would go to such lengths to alter a dying man's music? Holmes picked up the salt sample from his earlier analysis, still resting on a black ceramic dish. The answer lies not in the ink, but in the salt. You believe the salt was placed there deliberately? He nodded. No natural conditions in that room could have deposited salt. There was no source of water, brine, seawater, or moisture, which means it was carried by the killer or the composer himself. I frowned. But why? Holmes took a long breath. Watson, imagine a crime scene composed not of blood or bullets, but notes and silence. A man who controls every measure of a performance, every performer, every breath, and decides to write his own death into the final bar. You think he orchestrated his own murder? Holmes shook his head. No, but someone else played the final note. The next morning brought news that shifted the investigation entirely. Mrs. Hudson knocked gently, her face unusually pale. Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, she said. There's a gentleman here to see you. A Mr. Everett Shaw. We found the conductor in our sitting room, hat in hand, perspiration beading on his brow. He looked like a man walking through fog while chased by something unseen. I had to come, he said, voice strained. I couldn't hold it in. Holmes motioned him to a seat. Begin at the beginning. Shaw swallowed. I saw the final version of the score. The real one. He showed it to me privately, just hours before he died. And he told me, Shaw said, that if anything happened to him, I must not let the opera be played. Why? Shaw looked at us both. Because he said it contained a confession. A confession to what? I asked. Shaw's hands trembled. To a crime. But he never told me what. Only that the last 6 bars were more than music. That if sung in full, they would reveal everything. Holmes leaned forward slowly. Then it seems, Watson, he said softly, that the score was not merely the motive, but the method. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. The morning air outside the Royal Lyric Theatre was brittle and tense, as though the city itself held its breath. Holmes and I arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, summoned at the request of Sutton, the theater's managing director, who had agreed to let Holmes conduct private interviews with the principal members of the production. The premiere of The Siren's Promise had, understandably, been postponed. The public statement blamed an unexpected illness, but within the walls of the theater, whispers of murder flowed louder than any aria. We were shown into a modest rehearsal salon at stage level, with velvet-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle like an impromptu tribunal. Holmes stood silently at the center, surveying each of the individuals as they filtered in. Vera Ormond, elegant and self-contained, entered first, wrapped in a charcoal shawl. She nodded to us and took a seat without a word. Close behind came Basil Linley, the tenor, tall, flaxen-haired, and possessed of a dramatic flair that seemed inseparable from his everyday manner. He sauntered in, sniffing the air as if even the furniture were beneath him. The next was Mr. Sutton himself, a man of middle years with a fine mustache and a worried brow. His gait was deliberate, cautious, and he greeted Holmes with a tight-lipped smile before sitting at the far end of the room. Last came Everett Shaw, the conductor, whose visit to Baker Street the previous evening had revealed the most damning revelation yet. Today, however, he appeared subdued, as though sleep had failed to silence the score echoing in his mind. Holmes waited until the room had fallen into an uneasy silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you are here not as suspects, but as individuals intimately connected to the final hours of Mr. Roderick Dunbridge. I will ask questions, and I expect honest responses. The theater demands truth. And so do I." There was a rustle of coats and corseted posture shifts, but no objections. Holmes turned first to Linley. "Mr. Linley, I understand you had disputes with Mr. Dunbridge about your performance." Linley rolled his eyes. "He wanted the final aria whispered. Whispered. As if the crescendo of Act 3 could end with me mewing like a kitten. I told him it was musical suicide." Holmes was unmoved. "And did your disagreement grow heated?" Linley snorted. "Everything with Dunbridge was heated. He once threw a baton at my head during rehearsals. But murder? Really, Mr. Holmes, I'm a singer, not an assassin." Holmes turned to Sutton. "Mr. Sutton, as director of the theater, did you see Dunbridge on the evening of his death?" "I did," Sutton said slowly. "We met in his dressing room just before the final rehearsal. He appeared agitated, his hands were shaking." "Did he say why?" "He accused someone of copying the final score," Sutton said, glancing around the room. "He didn't name names, but he was certain a duplicate had been made." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Did he suspect anyone in this room?" Sutton hesitated. "He looked at Miss Ormond more than once, but I can't say if it meant anything." Vera's head lifted sharply. "He never accused me. Never. I was his confidant." "Confidant," Linley muttered. "You mean mistress." Her gaze darkened, but she said nothing. Holmes then addressed Shaw. "Mr. Shaw, you told me last night that Dunbridge believed the final bars of his opera contained a confession." Shaw nodded. "Yes, he didn't explain how. Only that it would make sense when heard. Yet you intended to conduct the premiere anyway?" I wasn't sure what else to do," Shaw admitted. "I thought perhaps it was some symbolic flourish. He often spoke in riddles." Holmes turned back to the group. "Let me be plain. The salt-stained sheet music found with the body was altered. Someone tampered with the final bars. The real question is why? To hide something? Or to prevent it being heard?" A ripple of unease passed through the room. Sutton glanced at Linley, who shifted in his seat. Miss Ormond's hands clenched in her lap. Holmes walked slowly to the window, then pivoted. "Let us consider motives. Mr. Sutton, you stood to lose financially should Dunbridge reveal something. Compromising? Preposterous," Sutton said, paling. "I kept that man's genius afloat through 3 failed productions. And you, Linley," Holmes continued, "you feared that a new composer might rise to replace you at the center of the stage. Ridiculous. Miss Ormond, your name is bound to this opera. If it collapsed, if it were disgraced, your career might fall with it." She stiffened, but replied evenly, "I would rather sing silence than lies." Holmes let that hang in the air a moment longer before speaking again. "And you, Shaw, you were the last to see him alive. You admitted as much." Shaw looked up. "Yes, but I didn't kill him." "No," Holmes said softly, "you didn't, but someone in this room tampered with his final act. And perhaps, just perhaps, that someone killed him to ensure the world never heard his truth." A long silence followed. Then Sutton stood. "Are we being accused, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes smiled politely. "No, sir. You are being observed. That is all. But I would advise none of you to stray far." He stepped toward the door, motioning for me to follow. "Come, Watson. There is still the matter of the ventilation shaft above the murder scene." And a curious absence of footprints. As we left the rehearsal room, I turned to Holmes. "What do you make of them?" He didn't answer immediately. "At last," he said, "the composer may be silent, Watson. But I suspect he still has one last performance left. And when the truth sings, it will not be in harmony." Chapter 5. First suspects the red herring that. Afternoon brought with it a peculiar twist, one that Scotland Yard was all too eager to accept as the final answer. While Holmes and I were still at the Royal Lyric examining the ventilation shaft above the crime scene, a breathless constable arrived bearing urgent news. Inspector Lestrade had made an arrest. The accused, Basil Linley. We found Lestrade in his usual state of quiet triumph, seated at a desk in the manager's office. Fingers tented as though presiding over his own inquest. "He's confessed to arguing with Dunbridge the night he died," Lestrade said, eyes glinting. "He was seen leaving the theater long after others had gone." Motive, means, opportunity. Holmes examined Lestrade for a long moment, then said mildly, "And do you also have a body of water in your back pocket? One that you can pour into a locked room?" Lestrade flushed. "We're working on that. And the salt?" Lestrade bristled. "Maybe he used brine. Or maybe it was already on the floor." "Ah," Holmes murmured. "So the death was not only convenient, it was cooperative." Lestrade stood. "Look, I know you think I'm too hasty, Holmes, but this fellow Linley had it out for Dunbridge. Even you said as much. The company knew he loathed the finale. Jealousy, maybe. Artistic spite. I do not deny that Linley had reason for resentment," Holmes said, "but resentment is not murder. Nor does it fill a man's lungs with water in a room entirely devoid of it." "But what about the score?" Lestrade insisted. "The salt-stained one?" "His fingerprints were found on the very edge, as were several others," Holmes replied evenly. "Miss Ormond's, Sutton's, even Shaw's, and yet none of them are in handcuffs." Lestrade looked away. "He lied about staying late. Said he left with the crowd. That, at least, is interesting," Holmes said, "but not conclusive." We made our way to the holding cells where Linley sat, still in costume from the previous day's rehearsal, the collar of his tunic wrinkled and one brass button missing. His expression was calm, if irritable. "I suppose," he said as Holmes entered, "you've come to gloat or to play detective." "I never gloat," Holmes replied. "I observe. And at the moment, I observe that your boots are clean." Linley blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Your boots," Holmes said, pointing. "Polished, dry, without the faintest trace of that damp gray dust found in the stairwell outside the storage room. Odd for a man who claims to have left Dunbridge late when the cleaning had not yet been completed." "I never entered the cellar," Linley said. "Yes, I argued with him. I told him his ending was madness. But I never saw him again after the rehearsal. I left through the front, walked home alone. And you lied about that yesterday," I reminded him. Linley scowled. "Because I didn't want anyone thinking I'd threatened him. We had words, ugly ones. But no more than that." Holmes considered him a moment longer. Then he turned to me and said, "Watson, if you please." Once we had stepped out of earshot, I asked, "Do you believe him?" Holmes gave a small sigh. "Linley is a vain man, and no doubt difficult, but I do not yet see a killer in him." But the lie. He panicked, as performers often do off stage. Lies make for poor murder weapons, too soft and too easily punctured. Back at Baker Street, Holmes lit a cigarette and resumed his earlier position in front of the fire. Eyes narrowed in thought. "Watson," he said abruptly, "you recall the ventilation shaft above the cellar?" "Yes," I said. "Barely wide enough for a man's arm." "Exactly. But wide enough, perhaps, to lower something small, wouldn't you say?" I frowned. "You think something was passed down through it?" Holmes nodded. "Consider the timing. Dunbridge is found drowned. No water source. No entry or exit. Yet above him is an opening no one can enter but through which one might deliver a method. Such as a bladder of brine," Holmes said, "punctured with a needle or blade from above. Slow, deliberate, and theatrical. It would soak the victim, fill his lungs with salt water mimicking drowning, and the residue salt crystals would remain." I sat back, chilled by the precision of the method. "But how could the killer guarantee it would work?" "They couldn't," Holmes said, "unless they controlled the setting. Knew Dunbridge would sit beneath it. Wait for his own composition to play in his mind. Perhaps even meditate in silence, waiting for the siren's last note. I murmured. Holmes nodded. Which means the killer didn't just act, they composed. This wasn't an act of rage. It was orchestration. The next morning brought further developments. A constable arrived with word that a second copy of the score had been discovered hidden behind the panels of Dunbridge's dressing room mirror. Holmes, and I wasted no time returning to the theater. The second score was carefully extracted and brought to the light. It was almost identical save for the ending. Holmes read the final bars in silence. Then he smiled grimly. There it is, he said. The original. The full ending. The real siren's promise. And the final 6 bars? He handed them to me. They were marked with annotations, cryptic, to be sure, but unmistakably deliberate. Breathe alone. Strike twice. Water returns. What does it mean? I asked. Holmes looked toward the empty stage, the velvet curtain drawn like a lid over a secret. It means, Watson, he said, that someone wrote a confession not with words, but with silence. And someone else tried to erase it. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The following morning brought with it a subdued rain and a gray London sky heavy with unched thunder. The city seemed to move at half its usual speed, as though it, too, was pondering the mystery that haunted the Royal Lyric Theatre. Holmes and I arrived just before noon. Entering through the back service corridor, where a maze of ropes, pulleys, and painted scenery whispered secrets in the stale air, we descended into the lower wings of the theater. Guided by a young assistant stagehand who seemed nervous merely saying the name Felix Corwin, he keeps to himself, the boy muttered. No one sees him much, sir. Has a little crawlspace under the prompter's box. Sleeps there, eats there. Won't talk to anyone if he can help it. Holmes nodded. He is still in the building. The boy pointed to a narrow stairwell. Through there. There's a hatch behind the orchestra pit. That's where he'll be. Holmes turned to me as we descended the creaking steps. A man who sees all and says nothing, Watson. A rare kind. I wonder what secrets he's been forced to hold in the darkness. The hatch opened onto a tight passage between the orchestra pit and the front of the stage, so low we had to stoop. At the end sat a small compartment with a stool, a candle stub, and piles of dog-eared cue sheets. Slumped in the far corner, curled like a question mark, was Felix Corwin. He looked up slowly as Holmes stepped into the glow. Corwin was a man of indeterminate age, perhaps 40. Perhaps older, with hollow cheeks and hair prematurely white. His eyes, though sunken, held an unsettling clarity, as though he'd memorized the world and then chosen to forget most of it. Mr. Corwin, Holmes said softly, you know who I am. The man nodded. Double quotes, and you know why I'm here. Corwin said nothing, but turned and produced a folded scrap of paper from the inside of his coat. He handed it to Holmes with fingers that trembled. Holmes opened it carefully. It was a sketch, rough but unmistakably accurate. A bird's-eye diagram of the storage cellar where Dunbridge's body had been found. Above the chair, a dotted line led from the ventilation grate to the ceiling above. And below the chair, marked faintly in red pencil, were the words, he sat waiting. The drip began. He did not move. Holmes looked up. You saw this? Corwin nodded again. You were inside the box during the rehearsal. Yes, the man croaked. He came down after everyone left. Sat alone, just sat. The grate above him. Something began to fall, slow, drop by drop. He never moved. Watson leaned forward. You didn't raise the alarm? Corwin's face twisted. He told me not to. Said he needed silence. He always knew I was there. Holmes stared at him. You watched a man die. I didn't know it would kill him. He said it was part of the music. Holmes turned the paper over and held it near the candle flame. Faint, beneath the diagram, was a second line written so lightly it was nearly invisible. He forgave her. Holmes read the words aloud. Corwin flinched. He said it just before he closed his eyes. Who? Holmes asked. The man hesitated. Who did he forgive? Felix. Corwin's eyes brimmed with a sudden, quiet panic. I don't know. He said it like it was a prayer. Holmes folded the sketch gently. You've done well, Mr. Corwin. Thank you. We left the crawlspace in silence, both of us weighed by the implications. As we emerged into the empty orchestra hall, Holmes stood still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. He orchestrated his own death, I said softly. Deliberately placed himself beneath the drip. Let it drown him. Holmes nodded. Which means we must ask not only who killed Dunbridge, but why he allowed it. But the salt water was prepared, Holmes finished. Administered slowly, intentionally. He waited beneath it. But the final act of the crime was not the salt. It was the silence. We crossed to the orchestra loft. Holmes examined the ventilation grate once more, measuring its size and location. He then turned to a set of levers marked for backstage effects. "Watson," he said suddenly, "do you recall the line from Harker's stolen score, A Strike Twice?" I nodded. Holmes pulled to marked chords in succession. A dull clang echoed beneath us, metal sliding on stone. He smiled grimly. "A trap mechanism, hidden. Stage hands use it to raise or lower props behind the pit. If someone timed it right, they could open a shaft in the ceiling just above the grate, allowing the brine to fall uninterrupted for several minutes before sealing it again." He gestured toward the stage. "Someone rehearsed this, Watson. Not in music, but in mechanics. And if Dunbridge cooperated, it was because he believed the ending would reveal the truth. And now, I believe I know who he forgave." That evening, Holmes laid out the sequence of events in front of the fire. Speaking in measured tones, Dunbridge knew he was a marked man. The finale was his confession, yes, but not to a crime he committed. To a secret he had kept. A secret about whom? I asked. Holmes looked at me gravely. Not himself, another. Someone in the theater. Someone whose career he had protected. But that person, knowing the finale would expose them however cryptically, struck first. He reached for the salt-stained forged score. And when they struck, they didn't merely kill a man. They tried to silence a message. But they forgot one thing. What's that? Holmes gave a faint, sardonic smile. Music, Watson, leaves echoes. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The following day broke with a strange calm, the sort of pale, soundless morning that seemed to wait for something to happen. Holmes had risen unusually early. When I joined him downstairs, he was already dressed in a plain black coat, a scarf tightly knotted around his neck, and an expression I knew too well, the grim intensity of a man about to test the limits of an idea. "You're certain of your theory?" I asked as we walked briskly toward the theater. "No," Holmes replied. "Which is precisely why it must be tested. There is a symmetry to this crime, Watson, artifice and precision in equal measure. It was not simply a killing. It was a performance no one was meant to applaud. On the contrary," Holmes said, glancing at me sidelong, "I believe the killer expected a standing ovation. So long as no one read the score too closely." At the Royal Lyric, Holmes spoke with the assistant stage manager and requested the theater be cleared for an hour. With the production still postponed and police matters ongoing, his request was granted without protest. The vast, velveted house lay empty beneath a lattice of chandeliers, the air thick with that peculiar scent of dust and old applause. Holmes stood alone at center stage. From the wings, I watched as he moved slowly, precisely, to the position where Roderick Dunbridge had died, the cellar chamber beneath the orchestra pit, now accessible via a maintenance ladder. The trap door lay open, a pale shaft of morning light illuminating the chamber's shadows. "I shall take the victim's place," Holmes called up. "I want you, Watson, to pull the lever mechanism I demonstrated yesterday, the one marked scenery drop to, but only when I gave the signal." I stared down at him. "You mean to recreate the drip?" "Precisely. I want to feel what Dunbridge felt. How long he waited. How deliberate it was." "Holmes, are you mad?" "No, only curious." "Which is not the same thing." Reluctantly, I ascended to the orchestra level and found the chord. Holmes, sitting in the wooden chair below, folded his arms and closed his eyes. "Now," he called. I tugged the cord. There was a dull sliding sound somewhere in the ceiling, metal against stone, followed by silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tap. Tap-a-tap. Water. No, it was heavier, more viscous. Holmes remained perfectly still. Then, after half a minute, he spoke. "Cease." I yanked the lever again. The sound stopped instantly. Holmes climbed the ladder slowly, rubbing a damp spot from his shoulder. "Well?" I asked. He nodded. "The drip was intentional, timed, and it wasn't water. It had the sting of salt brine, just as I suspected." He paused, thoughtful. "Dunbridge knew it was falling. He sat beneath it, unmoving, allowing it to soak his clothing, eventually his skin, and, I believe, his lungs. It would not have taken long." "And you believe someone helped him?" "Not quite. I believe he allowed it because he believed it was necessary. But I also believe someone used that belief against him. Holmes turned toward the wings. Come, it's time the cast performed for me, rather than for each other. An hour later, Holmes had gathered them once again in the rehearsal salon. Vera Ormond, Basil Linley, Everett Shaw, and Sutton, the theater's director. They sat in the same semicircle as before, though the mood now was sharper, tighter. As though each felt the net drawing closer, Holmes stood at the center of the room, a sheaf of paper in his hand. I wish to read aloud, he said simply, the final lines of Dunbridge's score. Not the forged version, but the one hidden in his dressing room. There was a visible shift among the group. Linley crossed his arms. Ormond's brow furrowed. Shaw glanced once at Sutton, whose lips pressed thin. In the last 6 bars, Holmes said, Dunbridge writes, let it be heard in silence. Breathe alone. Strike twice. Water returns. Cryptic. Certainly. But not meaningless. He began to pace. Let it be heard in silence, a clear indication that the final note was meant to be felt, not played. A breathless space in which truth would reveal itself not to the ear, but to the mind. Holmes turned on his heel. But the second phrase, or strike twice, has a dual reading. It refers, I believe, both to the mechanical trap used to release the brine and to an emotional betrayal. A second blow. The first was his silence. The second his death. He looked at Shaw. You told me Dunbridge said the score contained a confession. Shaw nodded, visibly tense. Yes, Holmes pointed at Sutton. And you claimed Dunbridge believed someone had copied the finale without his consent. Sutton stiffened. Yes, both are true, Holmes said, eyes glittering. But the confession was not Dunbridge's. It was someone else's hidden within the musical structure. And the forgery was not done to steal his music. It was done to silence it. He let that settle, then said, Mr. Sutton, where were you during the final hour of Dunbridge's life? The man swallowed. In my office. Drafting programs for the premiere. Alone. Yes, Holmes stepped forward, lowering his voice. You had the keys to the storage chamber. You had access to the prompter's schematic and stage crew levers. You had motive. Sutton's eyes narrowed. Motive. Holmes's tone darkened. Yes, because Dunbridge knew your past. The death of your former partner. The financial fraud covered by a sealed settlement. Dunbridge buried it years ago, but this opera, this final piece, would have revealed everything. He was tired of protecting you. Sutton half rose. That's absurd. Is it? Holmes said coldly. Then why alter the score? Why erase the ciphered notes in bar 34? Why attempt to drown a man without leaving water, unless you wanted the truth drowned with him? No one spoke. Then Vera Ormond's voice cut through the silence. He did protect you, didn't he? Sutton sat back heavily. The silence answered for him. Holmes turned to Watson and whispered, Tomorrow, we draw the curtain. I'll set the stage, and let Sutton take his final bow whether he knows it or not. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The evening that followed brought with it an air of expectancy, as though the theater itself had caught wind of Holmes's plans. There was no performance scheduled, no rehearsal. And yet, as we approached the Royal Lyric under the lamplight of a damp London dusk, the building seemed more alive than ever, its windows like watching eyes, its doorways like half-open mouths whispering secrets from the dark. Inside, the stage crew moved quietly under Holmes's instructions. Holmes had requested complete control of the theater for the evening. Inspector Lestrade, at last shaken from his overconfidence in Linley's guilt, agreed reluctantly to Holmes's orchestration of what he termed a final arrangement. Holmes, however, said little of his intentions. He simply paced, adjusted lights, and had the trap mechanisms cleaned and tested. He gave one clear command. Everyone must return tomorrow morning for a final company meeting, one that cannot be missed. And then, as the fog settled over the street outside, the unexpected happened. A scream echoed from the theater's east wing, a high, cracking cry that broke the stillness like glass. Holmes and I rushed toward it, followed by 2 constables. The cry had come from the dressing rooms. We found Vera Ormond standing in the hall, trembling, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other pointing toward the open door of her room. Inside, the room had been torn apart, costumes flung from their hooks, makeup cases overturned, and on the mirror in red grease paint, a single word had been scrawled: silence. Holmes was already inside, scanning the room without touching a thing. Vera turned to me, voice shaking. I'd only stepped out for tea. 10 minutes. No more. Holmes held up a hand. And was anything taken? She hesitated, then moved to a drawer. After a moment, she gasped, "Yes, my music binder. The one with my annotated score. I eyed written Dunbridge's notes into the margin myself, just days ago." Lestrade, arriving breathless, stepped in behind us. "Another break-in? Same hand as the one at Harker's flat." Holmes turned, his eyes sharp. "Possibly. But note the escalation. First, a theft. Now an open warning." Lestrade frowned. "Why target Miss Ormond?" "Because," Holmes said, "she may know more than she realizes. Or rather, she may possess proof the killer can no longer control." He motioned toward the grease-painted mirror. "This is desperation, Inspector. The act of someone who believes the finale might still be heard." Back in our lodgings later that night, Holmes sat in near darkness, the firelight playing along the sharp angles of his face. He hadn't spoken in some time, and I hesitated to interrupt his chain of thought. When he finally stirred, it was to place two items on the table before him: the forged finale score, and a blank page from Vera Ormond's missing binder, which she had previously copied for Holmes. "3 break-ins, Watson," he said quietly. "Harker's flat. Sutton's old records, now mysteriously missing from the theater archives. And now Ormond's dressing room, all connected to the final bars," I said. "Not just the bars," Holmes replied. "The people who knew what those bars were hiding." He leaned forward. "You recall the phrase, 'Let it be heard in silence.' It's more than poetic. It's literal. Dunbridge wrote his confession into the music disguised in notes, yes, but more importantly, structured to be understood through omission. Through what isn't heard." He pulled a charcoal pencil from the desk drawer. On the blank score, he marked 6 bars, filling in the slashed C-sharps, and replacing them using the cipher he'd previously deduced: B-A-D, D-A-E, D. Then, underneath, he added another line from the recovered annotations. He forgave her. "Bad D," I read aloud. "But what does it mean?" Holmes tapped his pencil. "That's where I erred. I thought it referred to Sutton. But it is not Sutton whose name ends in D. It is not even a surname." He turned the paper to face me. "Bad D equals bad DD4. Daughter." I stared. "Vera." Holmes shook his head. "No, not her. But someone Dunbridge once called daughter, figuratively, a young woman under his protection. Someone whose shame he had hidden." He picked up a theater program from the stack. "Watson, in 1892, a young soprano named Eliza Tamson died in a fire in York, or so the story went. Dunbridge composed a lament in her name, a private piece, never performed." I furrowed my brow. "What of it?" "Eliza Tamson never died," Holmes said. "She vanished, changed her name, and reappeared on the London stage years later." He tapped a line in the program. "Assistant Director of Choral Arrangements, Ellen Darren." "She's here," Holmes said. "Quiet, background, anonymous. But I've checked the records. Her musical handwriting matches the forged score." I felt a chill. "Then she altered the bars, Watson. She orchestrated the forgery. And I believe she was in the theater the night Dunbridge died. But why would he protect her, if he knew?" Holmes smiled faintly, a touch of sadness in it. "Because he loved her. Not romantically but paternally. She was his pupil, his creation. And she had made one mistake, one buried long ago. He sought to redeem her with silence. But she feared exposure, even in that. And now," Holmes said, rising, "we invite her to the finale she tried to erase." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. Morning air had a brittle clarity to it, as though the storm that had hung over London for days had finally broken and left the streets scrubbed clean and raw. Holmes was already at the Royal Lyric Theatre when I arrived shortly after 9. The entrance hall, normally alive with echoes of rehearsals and chatter, had been transformed into a still and sober stage of its own. In the grand salon, under the watchful gaze of fading portraits and dark velvet drapes, Holmes had summoned the principal players once more. Lestrade hovered near the door with 2 constables, alert and silent. The room held the same suspects: Vera Ormond, Basil Linley, Everett Shaw, and Mr. Sutton. But now, a new figure had joined them. She stood at the rear of the room. Composed but pale, Ellen Darren, the assistant choral director. Dressed plainly in dove gray, she had the look of someone caught in the wrong scene of a play, deliberately still, eyes lowered, expression unreadable. Holmes didn't speak at first. He paced a slow circle around the group, the sound of his boots deliberate against the wood floor. "I told you," he said at length, "that the finale of the Siren's Promise was more than music. It was a confession." "But you assumed that the confession was Dunbridge's." "It was not." He turned to face Ellen Darren. "It was yours." A long silence followed. The woman did not blink. Sutton frowned. What is this, Holmes?" "She's hardly been involved in the investigation." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "She has worked very hard to ensure that." He moved to the center of the room, his voice steady. "You all know the surface details. A composer is found drowned in a dry room. A score is tampered with. Annotations erased. Copies stolen. And at the heart of it, a message hidden in musical code bad deed, and a final whisper from the victim. He forgave her." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, do you recall the fire in York, 1892? A soprano named Eliza Tamson died in a blaze. The theater burned. No remains were ever found." Lestrade nodded slowly. "Yes, it was considered accidental." Holmes looked at Ellen. "It wasn't an accident, was it, Miss Darren?" Ellen remained silent. "Her name," Holmes said softly, "was not Ellen Darren then. It was Eliza Tamson." There was an audible intake of breath from the others. "She fled," Holmes continued. "Changed her name. Disappeared into the chorus world. Years later, Dunbridge found her. He took her in, protected her secret. He understood guilt, perhaps better than anyone, and believed she had suffered enough. And so he gave her a new role behind the curtain." He turned to Ellen again. "But then came the Siren's Promise. He wrote it with her in mind, didn't he? The title itself an allusion to betrayal, to drowning in silence, to the very thing you feared most, exposure." Still she said nothing. Dunbridge believed that by embedding the truth in music, by letting the finale speak in silence, he would free you from your burden. He even planned to announce, after the premiere, that the final movement was written for a lost friend. Subtle, oblique, but you feared it would be too obvious. Holmes lifted the forged score from his coat pocket. "You forged this," he said. "Removed the cipher. Stained it with salt after the fact to match the scene. Stole the other copies. Broke into Harker's and Ormond's rooms to eliminate all traces." Holmes took a step toward her. "But you didn't kill him." A tremor passed through the room. "I believe," Holmes said softly, "that Dunbridge chose to die. He believed it was the only way to give your silence meaning. He saw his death not as a tragedy, but as a crescendo. A sacrifice to bring the past to a close. But you feared he'd lost control of the narrative. So you tried to erase his death as well." At last, Ellen raised her eyes. They shimmered, though no tears fell. "He said the silence would absolve me," she whispered. "That no one would understand. But what if someone did? What if someone heard it anyway?" Holmes nodded slowly. "And so, you struck again. You forged the finale. You destroyed the message." Lestrade took a step forward. "Is that a confession, Miss Darren?" She nodded once. "I did all you've said. But I didn't kill him." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You may verify her handwriting against the forged pages. That, along with her access to the trap system and scores, will suffice." Lestrade signaled the constables, who quietly approached. Holmes, however, raised a hand. "One moment." He faced Ellen one last time. "Why did Dunbridge forgive you?" he asked gently. Her voice broke as she replied. "Because he said I wasn't the fire. I was only the match someone else lit." She allowed herself to be led away without resistance. Outside, the streets were bathed in cold light. Holmes and I walked in silence for several minutes before he finally spoke. "Dunbridge composed his own death like a final act, Watson. But he forgot that even in silence, the truth sings." I glanced at him. "Do you think he found peace?" Holmes was quiet for a long while. Then he said, "No, but I think he wrote peace for someone else. And that, in the end, is perhaps the greatest performance of all." Chapter 11. The Beatty Holmes Grand Strategy. It was nearing twilight when Holmes set his plan into motion, following Ellen Darren's confession to forging the score and tampering with Dunbridge's legacy. Most in the company believed the case was all but resolved. Lestrade had dutifully escorted her to Scotland Yard, confident that the storm had passed and the matter was closed. But Holmes was not convinced. "No, Watson," he said quietly that evening, as he stood by the hearth, hands behind his back. "The woman did not kill Dunbridge. That much is evident. She confessed to forging the score." "Yes, but she confessed too easily," Holmes said, pacing now. "And she never once asked how Dunbridge died." "Not truly." "Because she already knew." He turned toward me, His expression sharpened with focus. She wasn't afraid of exposure. She was afraid of failing him. There's a difference. And her actions, though desperate, were those of someone protecting a man's legacy, not committing his murder. Then you believe there's someone else? I do, Holmes said, stopping short. And I believe they're still within reach, watching, waiting to see if the final note has truly been silenced. I furrowed my brow. But if Ellen didn't lower the brine ... then someone else did, Holmes said grimly. And that someone had access to the stage mechanics, to Dunbridge's trust and, crucially, to the schedule of that final rehearsal. He walked to his desk and pulled out the original orchestra schedule. There, he said, pointing. A last-minute substitution. The man operating the trap lever that afternoon was not the usual rigging assistant. I leaned in. J. Holden. Holmes nodded. A temporary replacement. Brought in by recommendation. I've checked theater records. No such man was employed before or after that day. A false name. Most likely, Holmes said. And now I intend to draw him out. He produced a sealed envelope from the drawer, stamped with the crest of the Royal Lyric. You sent a letter. I asked. I did. To each member of the company. And a public notice has gone up. One final private performance of The Siren's Promise, tomorrow evening. Invitation only. The audience will consist of 5 individuals. Lestrade, myself, you, Miss Ormond, and the killer. He smiled faintly. We're going to let the music speak for itself. The next evening, under cover of an empty house and flickering gaslight, the theater felt like the belly of a sleeping beast. A single lantern illuminated the pit. Holmes had instructed every technician and constable to stay hidden, leaving only us visible in the grand stalls. Miss Ormond, draped in black velvet, sat silently beside me. Her fingers clutched the edge of the program Holmes had prepared, identical to Dunbridge's original, including the true, unaltered finale. The annotations had been restored. The final 6 bars, "Let it be heard in silence," remained intact. Holmes moved across the darkened stage with slow precision. At his side, the page turner, unaware of the trap, adjusted the conductor's podium. The air was thick, more with memory than music. Holmes addressed us from the footlights. Tonight's performance will not be sung, he said quietly. It will be felt. Every note, every silence. He turned toward the shadows and nodded. The music began, not played by orchestra, but faintly, through a recording cylinder Holmes had prepared earlier. It echoed softly through the rafters. Dunbridge's last composition. Played exactly as written, note by note. It rose, swelled, and fell. Then came the finale. 6 bars of silence. The audience, such as we were, sat motionless. And in the wings, something shifted. Holmes looked up. There, he whispered. A figure had moved, a shadow behind the curtain. The silhouette of a man, slinking toward the rigging controls just above the prompter's box. Lestrade rose quietly, signaling the constables, who were hidden behind the royal boxes. Holmes strode calmly to the orchestra pit and called out. You know, of course, that the trap is primed. That the finale remains unedited. You couldn't let it play, could you? Not again. Not with witnesses. The figure froze, then bolted, but the theater was ready. A sudden clang of boots. A shout, and moments later, the man was brought down near the side wings, wrestled to the ground, and dragged into the lamplight. I rose with disbelief. It was Everett Shaw, the conductor. Holmes remained still as the constables pulled Shaw forward. His face pale, mouth tight with fury. You, I said. But you were Dunbridge's closest colleague. I was his tool, Shaw hissed. He made me a marionette, told me nothing, hid everything. He was going to undo all of us with that damned finale. Holmes tilted his head. Because it exposed you. Shaw's eyes flicked up, wild. He said he forgave her. But he would never forgive me. You were the one who lowered the brine, Holmes said. You wore gloves. Timed the trap yourself. You convinced Dunbridge it was part of the drama, part of the music. Shaw laughed, bitter. He wanted to die. He begged for silence. I gave it to him, but you didn't count on his music surviving, Holmes said coldly. On the finale, living longer than the composer. Shaw's expression broke, then cracked, not with guilt, but with fatigue. He slumped. You don't know what it's like, he whispered, to live in the shadow of someone whose genius blots out everything else. I was supposed to conduct the Royal Festival. Instead, I was taking notes from a madman who thought music could confess crimes. Holmes turned away. Take him, Lestrade, as the constables led Shaw down the aisle and into the waiting darkness beyond. Holmes returned to the stage and lifted the score. He handed it silently to Miss Ormond. She looked down at the final page, her fingers brushing the margins. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Holmes answered without hesitation. "We let it be heard." Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. Next morning dawned with an uncommon stillness. The rain had ceased. The streets of London, slick with memory, reflected the pale light like a sheet of old silver. Back in our Baker Street lodgings, I found Holmes standing before the hearth, a cup of untouched tea resting on the table beside him. He was not reading the paper, though the headlines already buzzed with the previous evening's dramatic arrest at the opera. Instead, he held a single page in his hand. It was the final sheet of the Siren's Promise, unaltered, unforged, annotated in Roderick Dunbridge's own hand. I watched as Holmes slowly lowered the page and turned toward me, his expression marked not with triumph, but something softer, somber reflection, perhaps, or the faint ache of something understood too late. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you remember what you said when we first examined this piece?" I frowned. "I said it ended in limbo, that the silence was unbearable." Holmes nodded. "Yes, and I said the silence was the message." He turned and placed the page gently on the mantelpiece, where the morning light could catch its faint penciled lines. "Dunbridge wrote this, not as a confession of crime, but as an absolution. His final act wasn't meant to expose. It was meant to redeem. For Ellen Darren? For her, yes," Holmes said, "but also for himself. For Shaw, perhaps even for those of us who listened." He paused. "I misjudged him." I tilted my head. "How so?" "I assumed," Holmes said, "that he composed like a strategist. Every note a trap. But now I see he composed like a priest. Every note a prayer." He crossed the room and sat, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. Dunbridge knew Shaw was on edge. Knew Ellen's secret could not remain buried forever. He likely suspected the finale would provoke a reckoning. But he wrote it anyway. Not to condemn but to free. I sat across from him. And Shaw took advantage of that. Holmes's mouth tightened. "Yes, he weaponized silence against a man who believed in its purity. That is the true tragedy here, Watson." Dunbridge surrendered to music and never imagined someone would strike during the pause between notes. We sat for a time, the fire whispering between us, the echoes of the theater still lingering in our minds. At length, I broke the silence. "And yet, Holmes, you caught him." "Shaw, I mean. Your plan worked." Holmes looked up. "It was not deduction that caught him. It was temptation. He could not let the finale be played again. He thought we'd miss the message, that he'd erased it, but he left a trail." "No," Holmes said. "He left a pattern. And like any trained musician, he could not resist correcting a performance. When I reconstructed Dunbridge's finale, it was not just an artistic gesture, it was bait for a perfectionist." He rose and crossed to the window. "The moment of recognition was not mine, Watson. It was his." When he heard the silence again, he knew the lie hadn't held. I rose to join him. Outside, the city rolled on, oblivious to the man whose death had echoed through one of its greatest halls. "What will become of Ellen Darren?" I asked. Holmes was quiet for a long time. Then, softly, "That depends on whether the law sees her as forger or mourner. I see her as both, and Vera Ormond. She will sing again," Holmes said, nodding faintly. "And perhaps this time, not for applause." He looked down at the sheet music once more. "There's a certain poetry to it, Watson. Dunbridge spent his life perfecting control over time, rhythm, harmony. But in the end, his greatest statement was what he chose not to play." We were interrupted then by the knock of a messenger at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a crisp envelope, its seal bearing the mark of the Royal Opera Association. Holmes opened it carefully and read in silence. When he finished, he handed it to me. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, on behalf of the board. "We extend gratitude for your recent services to the Royal Lyric Theatre. In recognition of your investigation, we wish to inform you that the final performance of Roderick Dunbridge's The Siren's Promise will be held next fortnight. As originally written and unaltered, the finale shall be performed in silence, as per the composer's design. Yours, etc." I looked up. Holmes met my gaze with a quiet intensity. "They'll play it?" I asked. "No," Holmes said. "They'll honor it." "That's better." We stood in silence once more, the weight of the past days settling into memory. The case had closed, yes, but unlike most, it left no victory in its wake. No sharp boast. No tidy bow. Just silence, and within it, truth. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape Heathweek that followed moved with a deceptive calm. Shaw had been charged with murder. Though the case was already drawing press attention for its complexities, a composer's final bar, read one headline. Another called it the silence that sang a confession. The legal intricacies were mounting. And Lestrade, never a man fond of ambiguity, was growing restless with the questions he could not tidy into clear boxes. Holmes, for his part, remained uncharacteristically still. He refused invitations to speak with reporters, declined interviews with music journals, and even ignored a request from Scotland Yard to clarify certain points for the Crown Prosecutor. When I pressed him on it, he merely said, "Let the silence speak for itself," but I knew him too well. There was something else. On the 7th day. It came, a thin letter, hand-delivered, bearing no return address and postmarked from Clapham. Holmes read it silently. "Then read it again." I waited. At last, he handed it to me. The note was brief. **I have watched the performance unfold. The final act was never his to write. You were clever, Mr. Holmes, but he was cleverer still. Meet me at midnight. Backstage door. Come alone. D***. I said aloud. "But Shaw is in custody." Holmes's face was unreadable. "He is. Which means someone else remains in the wings." He stood. "Prepare your coat, Watson. We are going back to the theater." The Royal Lyric Theatre was locked and dark by the time we arrived. The gas lamps on the street cast long shadows across its carved stone columns and blackened windows. We waited by the rear entrance, tucked beneath the iron awning, where coal deliveries were usually made. At midnight exactly. The door creaked open. No figure stood there, only a soft breeze and a faint echo from the empty corridors beyond. Holmes stepped inside without hesitation. I followed. The theater felt different. Hollow. Yes, but not abandoned. There was a tension to it, as if it were holding a breath it dared not release. We passed through the backstage halls, past ropes and sandbags, paint tins and dust-covered props, until we reached the prompter's box near the orchestra pit. The lantern Holmes carried through long shadows across the walls and thereby the rigging. Standing with one hand on the lever was Felix Corwin, the silent prompter. He turned slowly, blinking against the light. His eyes were vacant, but focused, like a man who had rehearsed this moment endlessly. "I knew you would come," he said. Holmes stepped forward. "You wrote the letter." Corwin nodded. "I watched everything," he said. "From below. From between the curtains. I watched them lie, one after another." Holmes's voice was gentle. "You were there the night he died?" "Yes," Corwin said. "And the night before? And the night before that?" "I saw it all. I heard Shaw whisper to Dunbridge. I watched them set the lever. I saw the brine sack pass down. But I said nothing." "You were afraid?" "No," Corwin whispered. "I was loyal." There was a long silence. Then he added, "But he didn't die the way they think." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Corwin stepped back from the rigging. His voice trembled. "He didn't die during rehearsal. He died hours later. I saw him leave the pit. He walked, alone, staggering, but breathing. I felt a chill. Then the salt water didn't kill him." Corwin shook his head. "No, it weakened him, confused him, but it didn't drown him." Holmes's voice was low, firm. "Then who finished it?" Corwin looked away. "I don't know. I fell asleep beneath the stage. When I woke, he was dead." Back in the same chair, Holmes moved slowly, carefully. "And why call me here?" Corwin hesitated, then reached into his coat and removed a sealed envelope. "He left this for you. Said to give it to you if anyone else tried to claim the finale." Holmes took the envelope and opened it with great care. Inside was a single line, in Dunbridge's handwriting. "Truth, like silence, cannot be stolen, only feared." Below it was a signature. And a second, fainter line. "Let it be heard." Holmes folded the letter, his expression unreadable. "I believe," he said softly, "that you have fulfilled your role, Mr. Corwin." The prompter nodded once. Then he turned and walked slowly into the dark hallway behind the rigging. The sound of his boots receding into silence. We left the theater moments later. Stepping out into the cold breath of midnight, I turned to Holmes. "What now?" He looked down at the folded letter in his hand. "There was another hand in this, Watson. One who waited until the composer had weakened himself, then made certain the silence became permanent. But Shaw was the first attempt," Holmes said. "The one who set the scene. But someone else ensured it ended." I stared at him. "Then the game is not over." Holmes gave a small, grim smile. "No, Watson. The curtain has not yet fallen." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed next morning found Holmes in rare form, tense, silent, and sharper than I had seen him in weeks. He had been up before dawn, rifling through correspondence, theater schedules, even ink samples retrieved from our earlier visit to Dunbridge's dressing room. I recognized the signs. Something had cracked open in his mind during the long, silent hours following Felix Corwin's revelation. But he said nothing of it, at least not yet. "Watson," he said at last, tapping his knuckles rhythmically against the edge of the desk, "I require two things. First, a private meeting with Lestrade at Scotland Yard. Second, the theater's maintenance log for the past 3 months." I blinked. The maintenance log. He turned to me, eyes alight with that terrible energy that often accompanied the final movements of his reasoning. "The truth," he said, "is not in the music, nor in the forgery, nor even in the brine. It's in the moments no one noticed. The absences. The gaps within the hour. We were on our way to Scotland Yard. Lestrade, tired but obliging, met us in a dim back office lined with ledgers and stacks of notes. Holmes wasted no time. "I want access to the arrest logs for the day after Dunbridge's death," he said. "Any temporary detainments, particularly anyone released within 24 hours without charge." Lestrade furrowed his brow. "And why, may I ask, are we chasing red tape when we've got our killer in holding?" Holmes gave him a sharp look. "Because the wrong man is in your cell." Lestrade's mouth twitched, but he said nothing, merely turned to his cabinet and began rifling through the drawers. After several minutes, he pulled a thin folder and handed it to Holmes. "Name's Michael Greaves. Picked up near the theater for loitering. Suspicious behavior. Said he was waiting for a friend. Carried no papers. Released 12 hours later. Theater staff couldn't identify him." Holmes scanned the report. "And the arresting constable said he had theater grease under his nails?" Lestrade nodded. "Stagehand, most likely. No priors. Why?" Holmes folded the folder slowly. "Because Greaves was never employed at the Royal Lyric, and yet his name appears in the theater's service records 3 times once a week always as a substitute rigging assistant." Lestrade blinked. "A false hire." "More than that," Holmes said. "He was the hand no one questioned. The one person who could move freely behind the scenes, wearing anonymity like a costume. Then you think he'd finished the job," Holmes said coldly. "After Dunbridge staggered from the pit. After the brine had weakened him. Greaves followed him. Waited for the others to leave. And when Dunbridge returned to his chair, perhaps to reflect, perhaps to revise, Greaves ensured the silence became permanent." Lestrade rubbed his jaw. "But who was he working for?" Holmes looked at me. "That, Watson, is the question that's been bleeding through this case like a watermark. Who would benefit from Dunbridge's death not merely as a matter of revenge or panic, but professionally?" I thought back to the names: Shaw, Sutton, Ormond, Harker, Linley. And then I remembered Sutton's words, days earlier. He was certain someone had copied the finale. "Holmes," I said slowly, "someone wanted the score. The real one." Before the performance, Holmes nodded grimly. "And someone else sold it." He turned to Lestrade. "Issue a notice for Michael Greaves. Cross-reference his description with known aliases tied to document theft and forgery in the last 5 years. He's not new to this, and where will you be?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Backstage. Watching the stage manager." An hour later, we were at the Royal Lyric once more. The theater felt different now, emptier. Yes, but also strangely brighter. As if the ghosts had begun to retreat, Holmes asked for Sutton. We found him in his office, already packing up files, stage notes, and payroll ledgers. He looked up, startled, as Holmes entered. "Mr. Holmes," he said cautiously. "What brings you?" Holmes held up the maintenance log. "I reviewed the rigging schedule. I find it interesting that Michael Greaves appeared 3 times each during critical rehearsals. And always under your signature." Sutton blinked. "It was a standing arrangement. Our casting manager handles substitutes, does she?" Holmes asked, stepping closer. "Because I spoke with her. She claims you overrode the standard process for Mr. Greaves." Sutton's mouth opened, then closed again. Holmes's voice lowered. "He wasn't a stagehand. He was a forger. A smuggler. And you hired him to steal the final movement." "That's absurd." "No," Holmes interrupted. "What's absurd is believing Dunbridge wouldn't notice his own work being lifted. Which is why he encoded the finale. Which is why you had to silence it before it reached an audience." Sutton backed toward his desk. I never meant for him to die. You meant to sell the score, Holmes said. To a rival house. Maybe in Vienna. Maybe Paris. But Dunbridge suspected it. And the silence at the end of the opera, it wasn't just poetic. It was a signal. A warning. To you. Sutton slumped into his chair. His voice dropped to a whisper. I just wanted out. We were drowning debts, cancellations, bad press. Dunbridge's name was all we had left. He wouldn't even let us run previews. I thought if I had a copy if I could sell it before the premiere ... And when he refused to give you the rights, Holmes said coldly, you brought in Greaves. And when that wasn't enough, you let Shaw orchestrate the rehearsal accident, but Dunbridge survived. So Greaves returned and finished the finale your way. Outside, we heard Lestrade's voice rising in the corridor. Greaves is in custody, he called from the hallway. Picked up at King's Cross with a travel bag and one falsified score. Holmes turned back to Sutton. His voice flat. Your theater will survive, Mr. Sutton, but you will not direct its curtain call. Chapter 15. The final Gatheringet was late afternoon when we returned once more to the Royal Lyric Theatre, this time not in pursuit, but in resolution. The wide marble foyer, which had echoed with suspicion and silence, now felt subdued in a different way, as though it awaited closure. Lestrade had arranged for the principals of the case to be gathered in the grand rehearsal salon at Holmes's request. Holmes, of course, had told no one of what exactly he intended to say. He was always at his most deliberate when the performance mattered most. As we stepped inside, the room greeted us with familiar faces worn now with fatigue, confusion, and the remnants of grief. Vera Ormond sat upright in the same velvet-backed chair she had claimed during earlier gatherings. Shaw was absent, still in custody. Ellen Darren, now cleared of murder but not of guilt, kept her eyes low. Mr. Sutton stood near the window, feigning composure but pale beneath his mustache. Basil Linley was the only one who looked genuinely bored. Holmes entered silently and walked to the front of the room, standing beneath the chandelier's pale glow. I thank you all for coming, he said. I know many of you believed the matter concluded. He held up the recovered original score of The Siren's Promise, now restored and complete. Roderick Dunbridge died not merely from betrayal, but from believing his final composition would be stolen, distorted, and buried. But that score, he lifted the pages slightly, is intact. It will be heard without revision. There was a murmur among the group, but Holmes raised a hand. You've all played your parts. Some in innocence, some in silence, some, however, in calculation. He turned to Sutton. You told us you supported Dunbridge, that you backed his vision, that you believed in the premiere. But your real ambition was not artistic, it was financial. Sutton's expression hardened. That's a baseless accusation. Holmes took a step forward. Is it? You hired a man under a false name, Michael Greaves, to infiltrate your own theater. You signed him in 3 times under the rigging schedule during the most crucial rehearsals. And you used him to steal Dunbridge's score and sell it to a rival house in Vienna before the premiere could secure the rights. Sutton's eyes darted toward the door. That's absurd. No one can prove that. Holmes smiled thinly. You're quite right. No one can prove that. Except Greaves himself. He gestured toward the far end of the room and in stepped Lestrade, with a subdued, but very real Michael Greaves in tow. Shackled, hands lowered, eyes defiant. He's already signed a statement, Lestrade said. Says he was paid in advance to lift the manuscript and deliver it via King's Cross, and he had the forged score on him when we caught him. Vera Ormond gasped softly. Ellen Darren stiffened but said nothing. Linley, for once, sat up. Holmes's voice dropped. But it was not just theft, was it, Mr. Sutton? When Dunbridge altered the finale to include a silent confession to warn the audience of your treachery, you panicked. Shaw, your collaborator, had already weakened Dunbridge through a staged accident. But when the composer survived, you sent Greaves again to finish it. Sutton's face had lost its color. You have no proof of that. Holmes reached into his coat and produced the original inkstain page from Vera Ormond's dressing room. Commercial printer's ink, he said. Used to forge the finale. Not by Shaw, not by Ellen, but by Greaves under your direction. Greaves said nothing. He looked straight ahead, perhaps resigned, perhaps relieved. Holmes continued, softer now. Dunbridge left behind a note. A single line. Truth, like silence, cannot be stolen, only feared. That was his final message. And you feared it. That's why you tampered with the music. That's why you silenced him. Sutton made no reply. At last, he sat down heavily in the nearest chair, staring into nothing. Lestrade gave a subtle nod. And the constables approached. "I believe we're done here," Holmes said quietly. As Sutton was escorted from the room, Vera rose. "Will the opera be performed?" Holmes turned to her, his face unreadable. "It will, as he intended. The silence will remain. And this time, it will speak." Ellendarren met Holmes's gaze. "You believed me. Even when I didn't. You were never the villain," Holmes replied. "You only carried the weight." Linley cleared his throat. "And what of me?" "No one has asked." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "You were irrelevant. But I admire your persistence." The group slowly dispersed, one by one, drifting from the salon like the closing bars of a symphony. Holmes and I remained behind. He sat down, pulled out the finale once more, and looked at it one last time. This was his voice, he said, and now, at last, it will be heard. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime myth following evening. The Royal Lyric Theatre stood illuminated not by the grandeur of chandeliers or the thunder of applause, but by the steady flicker of truth. Holmes had arranged for one final meeting in the performers' lounge, a smaller, more intimate room tucked behind the stage, where so many secrets had been whispered and so much music conceived. It was here he had chosen to deliver his closing act. Present were those whose names had circled the crime like satellites: Vera Ormond, Ellendarren, Basil Linley, Lestrade, and myself. The constables stood quietly by the door. Sutton, now in custody, was absent, his role complete. Holmes stood before us, the original score of the Siren's Promise laid open across a music stand. "No curtain rises tonight," he said. "But I believe it is time for the final movement." He gestured to the score. Roderick Dunbridge was many things: brilliant, obsessive, private. But above all, he was a composer of control. Every note mattered. Every silence had purpose. Which is why, when he discovered that his music had been copied and was about to be sold abroad, he chose not to confront it with force, but with art. Holmes turned the final page toward us, his finger gliding along the annotated line. Instead of denouncing the theft publicly, he rewrote the finale, not just as music, but as a coded confession. In these last 6 bars, he altered the phrasing, included a series of slashed note C-sharps meant to be read as substituted letters. A cipher, a warning. He moved to the next page. He wrote, "Let it be heard in silence," a phrase that seems poetic, but was in fact literal. He wanted the final scene to fall into a breathless hush, so that the audience and those responsible would feel the absence of what they expected. A silence pregnant with meaning. He paused, turning to Vera. "He confided in you, didn't he? Told you the ending had changed?" Vera nodded. "Yes," he said. "It was a statement, something that only those who had betrayed him would understand." Holmes continued, his voice steady. "That message was directed at one man in particular, Albert Sutton, the theater's director." Dunbridge had learned that Sutton had hired a man named Michael Greaves, under a false name, to infiltrate the theater as a temporary rigging assistant. Greaves stole the score, intending to sell it to a rival house in Vienna before the premiere. In exchange, Sutton would receive a share of the rights. Lestrade spoke for the first time. "And Shaw?" "Everett Shaw," Holmes said, "was Sutton's accomplice. He had his own bitterness. Years in Dunbridge's shadow, always conducting, but never credited. Sutton and Shaw conspired to weaken Dunbridge before opening night. Shaw laced the rehearsal schedule with stress. Then, with Sutton's approval, he administered the salt brine drip through a concealed trap intended to incapacitate Dunbridge just long enough to delay or cancel the performance." I leaned forward. "But he didn't die," Holmes nodded. "No, that's what disrupted their plan. Dunbridge survived the rehearsal. He staggered away disoriented, perhaps already poisoned by the brine. He returned to the orchestra cellar sometime after midnight." He turned toward Ellendarren now. "And you found him?" Her breath caught. "Yes, I went looking for him. He had asked me to review the finale with him privately. When I found him, he was seated in the chair, slumped. I thought he was asleep." "You didn't see Greaves?" She shook her head. "No, but the door had been unlocked." Holmes looked to Lestrade. "We now know Greaves returned to the theater sometime after 2 in the morning, using a backstage key. Dunbridge was already weak. Greaves, perhaps instructed by Sutton or acting of his own accord, ensured the finale was completed not on paper, but in flesh." I shuddered. "He made it appear as though Dunbridge had died beneath the brine, alone." Holmes nodded grimly. "And the trap was reset. The salt residue remained. The illusion was complete." He stepped back. But the one thing they failed to remove was the silence itself, because Dunbridge had already written it into the music. The forgery, the break-ins, the threats to Vera, all were attempts to keep that silence from being played. Holmes turned to the music stand and tapped the final bar, but as he intended, it was played. Not with instruments, but with breath, with attention, with dread. And it told us everything. He turned back to the room. The motive, then, was not passion. It was greed. The method a staged accident. The cover-up a forged score. And the confession? It was in the notes. There was silence now, not scripted, but real. Then Ellen Darren said softly, he didn't want justice. He wanted understanding. Holmes's voice was low. He wanted the truth to be heard. And now it has been. Lestrade stepped forward, clearing his throat. I'll have Shaw brought in again. And Greaves will face full charges. Sutton's fate is sealed. Holmes closed the score gently. Then let the composer rest. Outside, the night was still. Not cold, not stormy, just calm. Holmes and I stood at the edge of Covent Garden as the final gas lamps flickered above the cobbles. You never performed the finale. I said quietly. I didn't need to, he replied. The notes were never meant for the ears, Watson. Only for the conscience. We turned toward Baker Street in silence, and though the mystery had ended, I could still hear the echo of Dunbridge's final movement played not by any orchestra, but in the quiet between truths. Chapter 17, Outcome. And just a set of weeks had passed since the final silence fell at the Royal Lyric Theatre. Yet the ripples of Roderick Dunbridge's final work had only just begun to move through London's musical and legal circles. Holmes and I had returned to our routine in Baker Street, or tried to. But the shadow of the case lingered. There was something about the melody of guilt, the tempo of betrayal, that does not fade so quickly as a solved cipher. That morning, Holmes stood at the window in his robe, arms crossed, unread newspaper tucked under his elbow. They printed it, he said. I looked up from my writing desk. The verdict. He nodded, then passed me the paper. The headline read, The Composer's Betrayal. Sutton found guilty of conspiracy and fraud. I skimmed the article. Albert Sutton had been convicted after a brief but thorough trial. Greaves's testimony, backed by his own signature in the ledger and possession of the stolen score, had sealed the prosecution. Shaw, facing lesser charges, had accepted a plea in exchange for a full confession. Ellen Darren was not charged. Her part, though ethically tangled, had not been criminal. Beneath the main article was a second column. The Siren's Promise performed as written. It described the reopening of the opera now with its true finale intact. The audience, it said, sat in awed silence for the 6 final bars. Some wept. Others simply remained still, uncertain if the performance had ended. They've added a footnote to the program, Holmes said, taking the paper back. A single phrase. The silence is the meaning. He folded the page. At least someone understood. Later that day, we were summoned to Scotland Yard, where Lestrade greeted us with a rare mixture of admiration and fatigue. Holmes, he said, handing over a folder. You've untangled a web I would never have believed could be spun within a theater. Holmes accepted the file and flipped through the closing reports. There will always be webs where ego and profit intersect, Inspector. The theater only gave them a stage. Lestrade chuckled grimly. A shame, though. About Dunbridge. A brilliant man. He was more than that, Holmes replied. He was a man who tried to speak in a language none of us knew how to hear. Lestrade turned to me. He always sounded like this. Only when the case is over, I said. We left shortly after, and as we walked down the granite steps of Scotland Yard, I turned to Holmes. Do you regret not exposing Shaw sooner? He paused, considering. Perhaps. But the greater truth required time. Had we moved too quickly, Sutton might have slipped away. The story would have been incomplete. He glanced at me. Dunbridge deserved a complete ending. That evening, Holmes received a small parcel delivered by private courier. Inside was a bound copy of The Siren's Promise, the final score, printed as it had been written. Beneath the dedication to the performers was a single, handwritten note from Vera Ormond, asterisk to Mr. Holmes, for seeing what we all missed. For letting the silence play. Yours, Vera asterisk. Holmes read it once, then tucked it into the score. Some truths, he said, are not shouted, Watson. They are simply left standing like music at the edge of stillness. We sat quietly for some time. The fire crackled, a carriage passed below, and then Holmes rose. Would you like to hear it? He asked. The opera. No, he said. The silence. He lifted his violin case from its corner. From within, he drew out not the instrument, but the final sheet of Dunbridge's handwritten score. He placed it on the mantel, where it caught the firelight, and then he did nothing. No bow. No strings. Just stillness. I understood. That night, we heard it not in sound, but in what followed it, a finale. And a farewell. Chapter 18. Holmes' final reflection. Days that followed passed quietly, as London returned to its habitual rhythm. The newspapers moved on to fresher scandals. The Royal Lyric resumed its program with a new season of performances, and the names of Roderick Dunbridge, Albert Sutton, and Everett Shaw began to fade from the headlines, though not from memory. It was a cold, clear afternoon when Holmes and I sat again in our study at Baker Street. The fire low, the silence companionable. I had just closed my journal, the last pages filled with notes from the case we had titled, only half jokingly, "The Case of the Sheet Music Stained with Salt." Holmes was seated in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The faint hum of the city filtered in through the window, and for once, even he seemed content to let it all settle into place. Then he spoke, as if continuing a thought I hadn't known he'd begun. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the first time you heard a silence that mattered?" I looked up. "I suppose I've heard many, but never noticed them quite so sharply as this one." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Most people don't. They fill silence with speculation, or nervous laughter, or noise. But Dunbridge, he composed a silence that refused to be filled." I nodded. "And because of that, the truth survived." He reached beside him and picked up the bound copy of The Siren's Promise, the gift from Vera Ormond. He turned to the final page, the one he had refused to read aloud, and traced the bars with a fingertip. "He knew what was coming," Holmes said. "He foresaw betrayal. Yet instead of preventing it, he folded it into his work. He composed through the treachery. That is something even I find remarkable." I studied him. "You admire him?" "I do," he said, simply. "He had the brilliance of mind to confront danger and the discipline of spirit to express it without a word. That is a rare combination." We sat a moment longer. Then I asked, "And do you think Sutton ever understood what Dunbridge did?" Holmes shook his head. "No, men like Sutton never understand the depth of what they ruin. He thought in contracts and ledgers, not in cadence or consequence. To him, the opera was a commodity. But Dunbridge made it into a legacy." I stood and poured us both a brandy. The sun was fading beyond the rooftops, its light turning the room golden. Holmes took his glass, but did not drink. "There was one clue," he said, "that almost escaped me." I raised an eyebrow. "Only one?" He smiled faintly. "The salt." He leaned back in his chair. "Everyone believed the salt was a symbol of the sea, of drowning. But Dunbridge had no love for the ocean. He once described it, in an old interview, as a blankness that lacks memory." I waited. "So why use salt? Why brine?" He turned the score to the inside cover, where a note from the composer had been printed posthumously in the published edition. "Salt is the residue of something evaporated. A silence left behind. A sound that was once water. That is what I leave you." Holmes looked at me, his gaze unusually gentle. "It wasn't the method of his death. It was his final metaphor." A long silence passed between us, this one not composed, but felt. Then, at last, Holmes rose. "There will be other cases, Watson. More complex, more violent, more demanding. But this one." He looked out the window. "This one will remain." I followed his gaze. "Because it asked you to listen." Holmes nodded. "Yes, and because for once the solution was not in what a man did, but in what he refused to do." He picked up his violin and tuned it with a few quiet strokes. Then he played not the final notes of Dunbridge's opera, for those could never truly be played, but something soft, wistful, unresolved. He stopped just before the cadence, letting the final note drift into nothing. I understood. This was his tribute. This was his silence. And in it, I heard everything. The end.